Welcome back. So last time we talked about file organization for Premiere Pro and how I organize all my footage and my project files. So let's jump into creating our actual first project. So when you first open Premiere, you're going to be greeted with this screen, which says welcome back to Premiere Pro. If you have any projects that you were working on, they will be in the recent projects at the bottom. For our first project, we're going to click new project up in the top left. And then this is where you name your project. For simplicity's sake, we're going to name this My First Project, and that's just the name of your project. It's easy to find. Under that's the location, and that's where the actual project file is going to be stored. That's not where all of your video files are or your music files, none of that. It's just where the project file is stored. Back in my first video, I showed you my file structure, and I actually have a folder called Project Files underneath each project. So I'm going to browse to my YouTube folder, my projects, and then Premiere Pro First Project is what I'm calling this. And then there's a project file folder, and I'm going to use that folder. The rest of this you can leave the same. We're going to use time code format. If you want to, you can do frames if that's helpful. Time code, most people understand time, so that's a little bit easier. Audio, leave the same. Capture format, we're not capturing anything. That's for like a live capture. So then we're going to click OK. Then you're greeted with what is called the workspace. Premiere Pro comes with a bunch of workspaces. They're across the top here. Learning, assembly, editing, color, blah, blah, blah. We're going to click the editing workspace since we're going to be editing first. Color is if you're going to do any color grading or any color correction. It gives you this Lumetri color panel on the right hand side. Audio is kind of similar if you're doing any audio stuff. Graphics for titles, text, any kind of shapes you want to put on there. So we're going to go back to editing. And then let's talk about this workspace to begin with. Up in the top left, you'll see the source monitor, and that's where you'll see all of these source materials. So if you double click a file down in the project, you can see the source here. You can create in and out points, which we'll get to, and then you can drag video or audio. The next one on the right is the program panel. That is where the actual edited clips will be. So whenever you play your timeline after you stitch things together, this is what your final product will look like. The bottom left is your project panel. That's where all of your files are going to be stored. We don't have anything now. You said it says import media to start, so that's where you would import your files. The bottom right is called the timeline monitor. That's where the timeline is. That's where you drag and drop video, audio. That's where you do all your editing, your cuts, and things like that. Now, before we get started, I kind of like to do the same thing I do with my folder structure layout, is I like to have a template. You didn't see a template to begin with, so we're going to go through making a template before we import any media. And this is going to follow my folder structure. So if you right click down in the project folder, you're going to say new bin, and a bin is just, think of it as just a folder. It's an actual bin that holds files. So we're going to call this sequences. Premiere Pro uses a thing called a sequence, which is where you drag all your files to. That's your actual timeline. So when you create a sequence, you'll see that on your timeline, and you can see your audio tracks and your video tracks. We're going to do another new bin. We're going to call this raw. That's of course where our raw video footage is going to go. The next bin we're going to create, I'm going to call stills. That's for any images. Another bin for music. Another bin for sound effects. And then another bin for adjustment layers. We'll get to adjustment layers later, but I just like to have this set up. And that's pretty much how all of my projects are structured. I like to have all these bins so I can put the right stuff in the right place and I know where it's at. Again, this goes back to my file and folder structure. It just makes it really easy to drag things into Premiere. Again, you know where they're at, you're ready to go. In order to start editing with Premiere, you have to create what's called a sequence. And you can have sequences within sequences within sequences. You can nest all these sequences, but you need at least one main sequence to start dragging video and audio files to. So we're going to click on sequences, and then we're going to go down here to the new button, the new item beside the trash can. I'm going to say new sequence. This looks a little daunting, but I'm going to walk you through this to make this super easy. This doesn't really matter what you choose here because we're going to make things custom to us. 1080p, 23.976 frames a second, roughly 24 frames a second. Sequence name, we are going to change the sequence name to main sequence. That way I just know which sequence I'm dragging things onto. So in the top, we're going to go to settings. On this drop down, we're going to click custom. Now this next part is very important. This is the time base. This is how you shoot your footage. I shoot in 23.976. There's also a 24, 30, 60, things like that. You have to know what your camera is shooting in before you start these, because if you put 60 frames per second footage into a 24 frames per second, it may look a little weird. You may get some stutters. If you put a 24 frame per second clip into a 60 frame per second sequence, it's gonna look very jaggedy and jittery because you only have 24 frames, so Premiere is gonna fill in the gaps. It tries to do it intelligently, but sometimes that stuff can look very jittery. So again, I shoot in 23.976. That's what my camera is set to. If you're using a GoPro or something like that, you can tell if it's 60, whatever. I do export and edit everything in 1920 by 1080. I shoot in 4K because I like to take my 4K footage and smash that down to 1080p. I think it looks a lot more crisp. Your pixel density is a lot higher. The rest of this we can leave the same. Display format's the same as the time base. Progressive scan is fine. 48,000 Hertz is great for audio. And then this video previews is very important because if your computer is a little bit older or a little bit outdated, this preview file format and the size is what is shown in that program on it. This is not your export size. So you can downscale this to like a 720p if you need to. If your computer is struggling to render footage, you can downscale this video previews, and it's only going to affect that preview window up in the top right. It's not going to affect your final output file. So I leave that the same. My computer can handle the 1080 footage. I'm going to click OK, and then you'll see the sequences made down here in the project folder under the sequences, and it's also went ahead and opened the sequence in the timeline. So now this starts to look a little familiar. Down here in the main sequence now, you can see V1, V2, and V3. Those are your video track. You have quite a few video tracks. You only see 3 here, but you can always add new ones, so don't get scared. Under that, you see A1, A2, A3, A4, and master. That is your audio tracks. So whenever you drag a clip with audio, you will see the video track in the video, and you will see the audio track in the audio. You'll see the little lock buttons here on the left. You can actually, once you edit something the way you want it to, you can lock that track so you don't accidentally move something or shift something out of the way if you're trying to select something else. You also have the little eye, that's the track output. So if you want to hide something, you can click that and it'll hide that. If you think of these video tracks as layers, you can put something on video track 1, put something on video track 2, and it will layer on top of that. And then you can jump between the two, cut pieces out of one and to jump back to the other. We'll get to all that stuff later, but just think of these as layers in your video tracks. One thing I did not mention is in the middle here are all your tools that you're going to use. Your selection tool, track select forward, ripple edit, cutting. The main tools that I use are the selection tool and the razor tool. I make my quick cuts. I cut out all of the dead spaces in between talking. It is good to know your hotkeys for these. So the hotkey for the selection tool is V. That'll select that. The hotkey for the razor tool, also known as the cut tool, is C, and that'll switch to your little razor. Now that we have the sequence and we have the bin structure laid out, the next step would be to import your footage into the proper bins. Import your music into the music bin, your raw stuff into the raw bin. But before we do that, we're actually going to save this project. Control S to save, it's going to save that. The other thing is, since there's nothing imported in this project at this time, this is a great time to save an empty project. You can use this as a template for starting all of your projects. If you know all your projects are 24 frames, or if you create a project and you make a 60 frames per second sequence, you can save different project files. I'll show you what I do with that. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Save As. And I'm going to put this out under the resources folder, just because this could be for all of my projects. And instead of calling this my first project, I'm going to call this Chob Empty 24 1080. And that naming convention lets me know that this is a chill project, not a chill plays project. Some of those have game footage in them, so they are shot at 60 frames a second. I know this is the empty project, so this is my starter for everything. 24 frames a second, 1080p. So we're gonna save that. Now, if we close Premiere and we open it back up, it's gonna greet us with that screen again, and it's down in the recent projects, we're gonna see that project that we just saved. So I can keep this empty project. I can open this back up. All of my bins are there. My sequence is ready to go. Now when I'm ready to start a new project, the first thing I do is I'm going to save this as. It's Control-Shift-S to save as. And then if I'm starting a new project, I will name this whatever I need to. So my second project. And this is the project that I actually work in. You don't have to do this. You can set up these bins every time. You can set up the sequence every time. I kind of do things pretty standard. I like to have this empty project created for me. Moving forward, I can just open this empty project, save it as a new project name, start importing footage, and start editing. That's how I set up my projects. Hopefully this is useful to you. I know we haven't got into the fun stuff of editing and importing footage yet. This stuff is extremely important in streamlining your editing process. You don't have to worry about creating new bins or creating a new sequence. It's all there, ready to go. All you have to do is import your footage, name your project, and you're ready to go. So I really want to thank you guys for sticking in here with me. I know this is kind of a lot of information. If I missed anything or you have any questions, please let me know down in the comments. I will address them. I address every comment if you haven't seen that already. Click the subscribe button. It's down in one of these corners. I don't know, or click the thumbs up to like it, share it. I appreciate all the comments and all the subscriptions so far. It really helps the channel out and gets me excited to make more stuff. So happy editing, and I'll see you guys soon.